welcome to Dreamy Night Facts, the gentle learning channel. I'm so glad you're here tonight. This is a quiet place, a place where learning slows down, where history unfolds gently, and where curiosity can soften into rest. Here, you don't need to stay awake. You don't need to remember everything. You don't need to follow every detail. You can simply listen, or drift, or fall asleep whenever your body is ready. Tonight, we talk about the extraordinary life of Marco Polo. If you enjoy this peaceful approach to learning, and you'd like more quiet journeys like this, you're always welcome to subscribe to Dreamy Night Facts, though a new restful exploration is waiting whenever you need it. Before we begin, take a slow breath in and let it go gently. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your jaw unclench. Let the day loosen its hold on you. There is nowhere you need to go now. Nothing you need to solve. Nothing waiting for you on the other side of this moment. Only quiet. Only night. Before the great journeys, before deserts stretched endlessly beneath camel hooves, before maps widened and the edges of the world softened, there was a boy in Venice, born beside quiet canals, into a house filled with stories of distance. He would grow up listening to footsteps that had already crossed the world, carried by men who had walked farther than most could imagine. And one day, he would follow them. His name was Marco Polo, a boy born not into silence, but into stories. And those stories had already traveled very far. To understand Marco Polo's journey, it helps to begin in the place where it started. A city built on water, trade, and distance. His early childhood in Venice. A boy growing up at the edge of the known world. Before Marco Polo crossed deserts. Before he stood in the court of Kublai Khan. Before his name traveled across continents. He was simply a boy growing up in Venice. Born in 1254. Marco entered a city already shaped by distance and trade. Venice was not like most medieval cities. It did not sit behind walls or rise from farmland. It floated. Built across small islands in a lagoon, the city was a network of narrow canals, wooden bridges, and stone buildings that seemed to rise directly from the water. Boats replaced carts, tides replaced roads. The sound of footsteps mixed with the gentle movement of waves against the foundations of homes. From a young age, Marco would have understood that Venice lived by the sea. A city built on trade. Venice in the 13th century was one of the most important trading powers in the Mediterranean. Its ships traveled constantly to Constantinople, the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. Goods flowed through its ports in steady rhythms. Spices from the east, silk from distant lands, glassware made in Venetian workshops, timber, metals, and grain from Europe. Merchants were not rare figures here. They were the backbone of the city. Marco was born into one of these merchant families. His father, Marco Polo, and Uncle Maffeo were long-distance merchants, men who travelled far beyond the usual routes of Venetian commerce. Even before Marco was old enough to remember clearly, they had already begun journeys that would take them deep into Asia. Growing up without his father, one of the defining facts of Marco's early life is simple and often overlooked. His father was gone. Not for months, for years. Marco Polo left Venice when Marco was still very young, traveling east on a trading mission that would stretch far beyond its original scope. By the time Marco was old enough to form lasting memories, his father was already a distant figure. He was raised instead by extended family, within a household shaped by relatives and business life. This was not unusual in a merchant city, where men often spent long stretches at sea. But absence leaves its own kind of imprint. Marco grew up hearing about journeys rather than witnessing them. Stories instead of reunions. Venice was also culturally unusual for medieval Europe. Because of its trading reach, it stood at a crossroads between East and West. By Marco's childhood, Venetian merchants had regular contact with the Byzantine Empire and Islamic regions. Eastern fabrics, spices, and artistic styles were not unknown here. They appeared in markets and homes, sometimes subtly shaping local life. Even architecture reflected this blend. Byzantine domes, Eastern mosaics, and Western stonework existed side by side. For a young boy, this meant the wider world did not feel entirely abstract. It was present in small ways, in objects from far away, in unfamiliar languages overheard at docks, in travelers passing through the city. Marco grew up in a place where the idea of distant lands felt believable. The return of his father. Marco was around 15 when his father returned. Imagine that moment. A knock at the door, footsteps in a familiar hallway, voices that felt both known and strange. A man who was both father and traveler from another world. Sun-darkened skin, clothes worn by long roads, eyes that had seen cities no one in Venice could picture. And with him, stories. So many stories of deserts where the sky felt endless, of palaces larger than cathedrals, of emperors who ruled over millions. For Marco, this was not history, it was possibility. The house in Venice was no longer quiet. Where once there had been absence, now there was movement. Voices returning late into the evening. Maps unrolled across wooden tables. Soft candlelight falling over distant places. After years away, Marco Polo came back to Venice with stories few in the city could match. He had traveled far beyond the familiar trading circuits, far beyond Constantinople, into lands most Europeans barely understood. He did not return alone. Marco's uncle Maffeo was with him, and together they brought accounts of long roads across Asia and encounters with the court of a powerful ruler in the East. For Marco, this was more than a reunion. It was an introduction to a larger world. The road had entered the house, and it was not leaving. A name that would echo: Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of a vast and growing empire. His land stretched farther than imagination, from the Pacific coast of China, across mountains and deserts, toward the edges of Europe itself. To medieval Venetians, this was almost beyond comprehension. A ruler of cities made of stone and gold, of armies that moved like storms, of roads that seemed endless. And somehow, Marco's father and uncle stood within that distant world, speaking with a man whose power touched continents, reachable, and somewhere within him, a question began to take shape. Not spoken, not yet understood fully, but present. What if I went too? The Polos had returned to Venice, but they had not returned to stillness, because the East was already calling them again. Kublai Khan's request remained unanswered. The road remained open, and soon Niccolo and Maffeo would prepare to leave once more. Only this time, they would not go alone. This time, a young boy would walk beside them. A boy who had grown up between canals and candlelight, between absence and imagination. A boy who had never yet crossed a desert or followed a caravan trail into the unknown, but who soon would. We can imagine what those early months must have felt like. A household suddenly filled with movement and conversation. Maps unrolled, routes described, memories pieced together in long discussions that stretched into the evening. For a boy who had grown up hearing fragments of distant travel, this was something different. Now, the stories had faces, voices, details. Not legends, not rumors, but lived experience. His father had not simply traded abroad. He had crossed continents. This period likely shaped Marco more than any formal education. He was old enough to understand the scale of what he was hearing, but young enough to still be forming his sense of the world. The East was no longer an idea. It was a place his own family had seen. And slowly, a quiet transition began. Marco moved from being a boy who listened to stories to someone who would soon step into one. Looking back, Venice may have been the perfect place for someone like Marco Polo to begin. It taught movement, it normalized distance, it valued curiosity about the wider world. It was a city where leaving was common and returning was never guaranteed. By the time the opportunity came for Marco to travel east with his father and uncle, the idea would not have felt impossible. Uncertain, perhaps. Dangerous, certainly, but not unimaginable. Because he had grown up in a place where the horizon was always open. For a time, life in Venice continued as it always had. Ships came and went, markets filled with color and sound, church bells marked the passing hours. But beneath the surface, something was moving. The Polos were not men made for stillness. They had seen too much distance, heard too many roads calling their names, and slowly, almost quietly, a decision began to take shape. They would return. When the decision was finally spoken aloud, it did not arrive with thunder. No grand announcement, no sudden rush, just quiet certainty. Niccolo and Maffeo would return east. They would cross the same long roads again, through deserts and mountains, through cities where languages shifted like wind. And this time, Marco would go with them. He was no longer a child, 17 years old, standing between boyhood and something else. Old enough to understand the distance, young enough to be drawn toward it. Imagine that moment, to leave the only home you have known for a journey with no clear end. No maps that felt complete, no promise of return, only stories and the wide open road. For Marco, fear and wonder must have lived side by side, because the unknown is rarely one thing. It is shadow and light together, a quiet trembling and a quiet excitement woven into the same breath. The days that followed were filled with preparation, not hurried, but steady. Supplies gathered carefully, letters written, routes discussed in low voices. In the harbor, ships rocked gently with the tide, their masts creaking softly in the wind. Marco must have walked those narrow Venetian streets, seeing everything differently now. The bridges, the canals, the familiar corners of home, all of it still the same, and yet already changing. Because once you know you are leaving, even the most ordinary places begin to glow with quiet meaning. The last evenings, perhaps the evenings felt the most tender. Meals shared slowly, conversations lingering longer than usual. The small, unnoticed details of home beginning to gather weight. The sound of water outside the window, the smell of bread from a nearby kitchen, the low hum of a city settling into night. Moments that might once have passed unnoticed, now resting gently in memory. Imagine a quiet night now. A window open slightly, cool air moving through the room. Somewhere outside, water brushing softly against stone. Inside, everything still. A trunk not yet closed. Footsteps not yet taken. Just a calm pause before the road begins. Breathe slowly here. You are still at the threshold. And so, while still very young, Marco left Venice behind and stepped onto a road that would reshape the course of his life. Crossing the Silk Road, the long road east. When Marco Polo left Venice with his father and uncle, he was still very young, likely around 17 years old. He had grown up hearing about distant lands, but hearing and experiencing are very different things. The journey east would unfold in stages across many lands. It would be a sequence of landscapes, cultures, and long stretches of uncertainty. Travel in the 13th century moved slowly. There were no direct routes, no fixed schedules, and no guarantees of arrival. Only distance. The geography of the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not a single path, but a network of routes stretching across mountains, deserts, and steppe lands. Travelers adapted constantly, choosing routes based on season, politics, and local conditions. Some segments passed through fertile valleys and established cities where supplies were easier to obtain. Others crossed barren landscapes where survival depended on preparation and local knowledge. Marco would have encountered a wide range of terrain. High plateaus where the air felt thin, rocky passes through mountain ranges, wide river valleys with scattered settlements, vast deserts where the horizon remained empty for days. Each new region brought new challenges. As the polos moved east, communication became increasingly complex. The number of languages along Silk Road routes was immense. Traders often relied on intermediaries or learned fragments of multiple languages to function. Marco would have been exposed to Persian in major trade regions, Turkic dialects across Central Asia, Mongolian influences closer to imperial territories. Multilingual environments were normal for Silk Road travelers. Trade demanded flexibility. Misunderstandings were common, but necessity encouraged adaptation. For someone young and observant, this environment would have been an education in itself. The Silk Road was not inherently safe. Distance alone created risk, but there were other dangers as well. Banditry existed in certain regions, particularly where political control was weak. This was one reason caravans traveled in groups and often hired guards. Weather posed additional threats. Sudden storms in mountainous regions could block passes. In deserts, sandstorms could disorient travelers and animals alike. Illness also traveled easily along trade routes. With limited medical knowledge and long distances between settlements, minor conditions could become serious. Yet despite these risks, the Silk Road continued to function. For merchants, the potential gains justified the uncertainty. Navigation without maps. Navigation along the Silk Road relied heavily on experience rather than written maps. Many routes were transmitted through memory, passed from one generation of travelers to the next. Guides played a crucial role. These individuals knew seasonal patterns, water sources, and safe passages through difficult terrain. Their knowledge could determine the success or failure of an entire expedition. In open deserts, landmarks were often subtle. Distant mountain outlines, star positions, the texture of the land itself. Travelers learn to read environments with attention that modern life rarely demands. At night, the sky became an essential reference. Familiar constellations provided orientation when ground markers disappeared. This reliance on celestial navigation connected Silk Road travelers to much older traditions of movement across land and sea. The Silk Road crossed some of the most environmentally challenging regions on Earth. In summer, desert heat could become relentless. Temperatures climbed high enough to exhaust animals and people alike. Travel slowed, and caravans sometimes paused during peak daylight hours to conserve strength. In winter, conditions could reverse dramatically. Mountain passes became dangerous with snow and ice. Winds cut sharply across open steppe landscapes. Sudden storms could trap travelers far from shelter. Sandstorms posed another hazard. These events could arrive quickly, reducing visibility and reshaping familiar terrain. Experienced caravan members knew how to respond, securing animals, protecting supplies, and waiting for conditions to stabilize. Survival often depended on patience rather than endurance alone. One of the least visible aspects of Silk Road travel was waiting. Caravans frequently paused for reasons beyond their control. Seasonal weather patterns, political instability, animal fatigue, river conditions. These pauses could last days, weeks. For travelers accustomed to constant movement, waiting became a defining part of the experience. During these intervals, caravan camps turned into temporary communities. People repaired equipment, traded small goods, or shared information about routes ahead. Waiting was not an interruption of the journey. It was part of the journey itself. Imagine standing in a wide open place where nothing blocks the sky. No walls, no rooftops, no narrow streets. Just space, stretching in every direction. Take a slow breath here and feel how the world opens when nothing presses in. This is the feeling the road gives. A quiet widening. Reaching the court of Kublai Khan marked a major turning point in Marco Polo's life. The Silk Road journey had been defined by movement and uncertainty. The court represented stability, structure, and prolonged exposure to a civilization far larger than any he had known. After years of slow movement across deserts and mountains, the journey finally led to the heart of a vast empire. The court of Kublai Khan. entering the Mongol world. After years of travel across the Silk Road, Marco Polo and his family finally reached the territories governed by Kublai Khan. By this point, they had crossed thousands of kilometers and spent a significant portion of Marco's youth on the road. The destination was not simply another city. It was the center of one of the largest empires in history. For Marco, arriving here meant stepping into a political and cultural world unlike anything he had known before. Here, Marco transitioned from traveler to resident, from observer to participant. The road had carried him across continents. Now, for the first time since leaving Venice, the journey slowed. And in that stillness, a new chapter of his life began. One that would eventually send him traveling again, but now within the vast framework of the Mongol world. Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire. By the time Marco arrived in the east, Kublai had consolidated power over vast territories, including most of China and large parts of Central Asia. Unlike earlier Mongol rulers who focused primarily on conquest, Kublai governed from established capitals and worked to administer a diverse empire made up of many cultures, languages, and religions. He ruled not only as a Mongol leader, but also as the founder of the Yuan dynasty in China. This dual identity shaped the world Marco entered. As the Polos approached areas more directly controlled by the Mongol administration, they would have noticed clear differences compared to the more fragmented regions of the Silk Road. Travel became more structured, administrative oversight more visible, infrastructure improved. The Mongols had developed systems to support long-distance communication and governance. Roads were maintained more carefully, and official travel networks allowed messengers and envoys to move quickly across vast distances. For travelers arriving from the western edge of Eurasia, this level of organization would have been striking. The period of Kublai Khan's rule coincided with what historians often call the Pax Mongolica, a time when large portions of Eurasia were connected under Mongol dominance. This relative stability enabled long-distance trade and communication on an unprecedented scale. merchants could move more safely across vast territories. Diplomatic missions traveled further than before. Ideas, technologies, and goods circulated across regions that had once been isolated from one another. Marco's presence in the East was made possible by this broader historical moment. Without it, such a journey would have been far more difficult. Marco Polo is believed to have spent many years within the Mongol world, possibly over a decade or more. During this time, the court would have shifted from a place of initial wonder to a long-term environment. Familiar faces replaced strangers. Foreign customs became routine. Distance from Venice became a normal condition rather than a temporary state. This extended stay was unusual for a European traveler of the period. Most long-distance merchants eventually returned west. Marco's prolonged presence in the East set him apart. Before Marco began traveling across the vast Mongol world, he spent years inside the imperial court itself. A place shaped not only by wonder, but by structure and power. Court ceremonies and formal rituals were central to imperial life. These gatherings reinforced authority and reminded all who entered of the hierarchy that sustained the empire. At Kublai Khan's court, formal audiences followed strict protocols. Visitors were received according to rank. Envoys presented gifts in carefully ordered sequences. Officials observed precise rules of posture and speech. Ceremonial gatherings marked the seasons. Diplomatic receptions, administrative assemblies, and court celebrations. For foreign visitors like Marco, such rituals required careful observation. Misunderstanding etiquette in a highly structured court could carry real consequences. But over time, repetition softens the unfamiliar, and what once feels overwhelming gradually becomes ordinary. He did not remain a wide-eyed visitor forever. He adapted, and that adaptation allowed him to later describe the Mongol world not as myth, but as lived reality. By the time Marco eventually left the Mongol court, He had spent years immersed in one of the most complex political environments of the medieval world. This experience would shape how he later spoke about power, geography, and cultural difference. And when he eventually returned west, these memories would form the foundation of the stories that carried his name across centuries. Not stories of conquest, but of scale, and of a world far larger than the one he had left behind. A different kind of education. If Marco received a true education during his life, much of it likely occurred here. Not in formal classrooms, but through immersion in a functioning global empire. He observed administrative systems, trade regulation, cultural diversity, technological differences. This kind of experiential learning would later shape the way he described the world to European audiences. His perspective was not theoretical. It was lived. Imagine walking through a vast city in the early morning. Streets still quiet, soft mist rising between rooftops. Lanterns fading slowly as daylight begins to touch the edges of the world. Footsteps echo gently beneath wooden eaves. A breeze carries the scent of tea. No crowds yet. No urgency. Just the calm presence of a place that has existed long before you arrived. Let that calm settle around you. But arriving at the court was not the end of Marco's journey. In many ways, it was only the beginning. A wider world than expected. For Marco Polo, one of the most lasting impressions of his travels was not a single city or ruler, but the sheer contrast between the world he left behind and the one he encountered in the East. He had grown up in Venice, a powerful trading city by European standards. Yet even Venice, with its wealth and maritime connections, existed within a continent that was still relatively fragmented in its knowledge of the wider world. Asia presented something different. Not simply distance, but scale. One of the most striking contrasts between East and West was the scale of organization Much of medieval Europe was divided into smaller kingdoms, feudal territories, and regional authorities. In contrast, the Mongol Empire governed immense continuous territories. Administrative systems had to function across thousands of kilometers, linking distant regions under shared authority. For a European observer, this level of integration would have been difficult to fully grasp at first. These differences did not imply superiority in a simple sense, but they contributed to the feeling that Marco had stepped into a more interconnected environment than he had known before. Spiritual life added another layer of contrast. Europe during Marco's lifetime was strongly shaped by Christianity, which influenced law, culture, and intellectual life. Across Asia, Marco encountered a wider variety of belief systems. Buddhism, Islam, local traditions, shamanistic practices. This plurality would have broadened any traveler's sense of how societies organized meaning and morality. Rather than encountering a single religious landscape, Marco moved through a mosaic of spiritual traditions. Taken together, these differences did not simply inform Marco's travel memories. They reshaped his mental map of the world. He had left Europe assuming certain boundaries about governance, technology, and social organization. Years later, those boundaries had shifted. The world had expanded in dimension, not just distance. What once seemed universal now appeared regional. When Marco eventually returned west, he carried more than stories of faraway places. He carried a transformed sense of proportion. Europe was no longer the center of his lived experience, but one region among many. This shift in perspective helps explain the tone of his later accounts. He did not describe the East as mythical or impossible, but as structured. Real. Even when listeners doubted him, the underlying message remained clear. The world was larger and more complex than most Europeans had imagined. The cultural contrasts Marco witnessed did not instantly transform European society. Change of that scale takes generations, but exposure matters. Every account that crossed continents added small adjustments to collective understanding. Each description, however imperfect, contributed to a gradual widening of awareness. Marco Polo's journey was one thread in that larger process. A reminder that travel does not only move people across space, it moves ideas across horizons. And once horizons expand, they rarely contract again. Marco Polo's travels across Asia, moving within the Mongol world. After settling into life within the sphere of Kublai Khan's court, Marco Polo's journey did not stop. Later accounts describe him moving across different regions of the Mongol Empire, sometimes in administrative roles, sometimes as an observer, possibly as a courier or envoy. This mobility became one of the defining features of his time in the East. The psychology of long-term travel. Years of continuous movement can reshape a person's identity. Travelers who spend extended time abroad often develop a sense of distance from their place of origin. By the time Marco had spent over a decade in Asia, Venice was no longer an immediate reference point in daily life. Familiarity shifted. New routines replaced old ones. Foreign languages became normal. Local customs lost their strangeness. This gradual adaptation may help explain why Marco remained in the East for so long. The longer someone lives within a new environment, the less urgent the idea of return can feel. Distance becomes a state of mind as much as a physical reality. It is important to acknowledge that much of what we know about Marco's travels comes from accounts written later in his life. Historians continue to debate the precise details of where he went and what roles he held. Some scholars argue that certain claims were exaggerated. Others suggest that even if some details were embellished, the broader framework of extensive travel remains plausible. For understanding his life, what matters most is not whether every location can be verified, but that Marco emerged from his years in Asia with a perspective far broader than most Europeans of his time. Whether through official duties, merchant observation, or simple exposure, Marco's travels across Asia contributed to a gradual transformation. He did not return to Europe as a conqueror or missionary. He returned as something quieter, but historically significant. A witness. Someone who had seen a world operating on a scale unfamiliar to his homeland. This distinction would later shape how his stories were received. He did not claim to rule distant lands. He described them, and description alone was powerful enough. Marco Polo is believed to have spent roughly 17 years in the East. Daily life replaced novelty. Movement replaced milestones. Long-term travel rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It becomes a series of routines, departures, arrivals, adjustments, repeated until they form the fabric of everyday life. By the time the idea of returning west began to take shape, Marco had lived nearly half his life outside Europe. The road had stopped being a journey. It had become a way of living. The return journey. Turning back toward the west. After many years in the east, Marco Polo's life had settled into a rhythm shaped by distance. The idea of returning to Venice had once felt abstract, something that belonged to another life. Kublai Khan was growing older. The political balance of the empire was changing. For foreigners living within the Mongol world, long-term futures were never entirely certain. It was during this period that an opportunity emerged. One that would finally allow the Polos to begin the long journey home. According to historical accounts, the Polos were entrusted with a significant task. A Mongol princess was to be escorted westward to Persia, where she was promised in marriage to a regional ruler allied with the Mongol Empire. This kind of diplomatic marriage was not unusual. It reinforced alliances across vast territories and helped maintain stability. For the Polos, the mission offered something rare. A legitimate reason to leave. Departing the court without permission would have been unthinkable, but escorting a royal figure provided both authority and protection. It was a formal exit from a world that had defined nearly 2 decades of their lives. By the time Marco prepared to depart, he had spent most of his adult life in Asia. The court that once felt overwhelming had become familiar. Leaving such an environment would not have been simple. For Marco, the moment likely carried a complex mix of emotions. Relief at the chance to return home. Uncertainty about the journey ahead. Rather than retracing the overland Silk Road, the return journey began by sea. This decision was practical. Maritime routes, while dangerous, could move people and goods faster. The fleet departed from ports along the South China coast, entering vast maritime networks. For Marco, this would have been a very different kind of travel. He had spent years crossing land. Now, the horizon would be water. Life at sea. Sea travel in the 13th century was unpredictable and physically demanding. Voyages depended heavily on seasonal wind patterns. Sailors often had to wait for the right time of year. Life on board was cramped and repetitive. Space was limited. Fresh water was always a concern. Compared to the open landscapes of caravan travel, the sea imposed a different kind of endurance. Beyond physical hardship, the return journey carried a psychological weight. For someone who had spent years moving deeper into Asia, turning westward meant confronting time in a new way. Venice, once a fading memory, began to feel more real again. But memory is not static. After decades away, the idea of home can become complicated. Marco was no longer the teenager who had left Europe. He was a man shaped by distance. The journey home was not simply geographical. It was transitional. Eventually, the Polos reached Persian territories, and from there, the long path west continued. As they moved further west, signs of familiarity slowly returned. Languages sounded more recognizable. Architecture shifted. Trade routes overlapped with older memories. This was not stepping into the unknown. It was stepping back towards something remembered. When Marco Polo finally reached Venice, he had been gone for roughly 24 years. An absence long enough to feel like an entire lifetime. He returned carrying memories of empires, knowledge of distant systems, and stories that stretched far beyond European horizons. The return to Venice marked the conclusion of Marco Polo's longest physical journey. But endings in history are rarely final. Long journeys carry quiet weight. They're not made only of wonder, but of endurance. And yet, even through hardship, something keeps moving forward, a quiet determination. You can rest in that strength now, soft but steady. When stories found their voice, you might think that Marco's story would end with his return home, a quiet life, a peaceful closing. But history rarely moves so gently. Venice in the late 1200s was not a place of stillness. It was a republic of merchants and rivalries. Trade routes meant power, and power often meant conflict. Venice and Genoa, two great maritime cities, fought for dominance of the seas. During one of these conflicts, Marco commanded a Venetian galley. In battle, he was captured, taken prisoner by the Genoese. After crossing continents, he now found himself confined within stone walls, a different kind of journey, one without movement. In prison, Marco met a man named Rustichello, a writer, a teller of stories. And in the quiet of confinement, Marco began to speak. Slowly, patiently, as memory unfolded, he spoke of deserts, of emperors, of cities made of paper money and silk. And Rustichello listened. When stories reached Europe, when Marco Polo's accounts began circulating across Europe, they did not arrive into a world ready to understand them. Most people lived within small geographic circles. Even merchants often stayed within familiar routes. The idea that someone had crossed the breadth of Eurasia and returned with detailed observations of distant empires was difficult for many to accept. Skepticism appeared early. Marco described cities far larger than most Europeans had seen. He spoke of unfamiliar systems, paper money, vast canals, imperial administration. And his memories were written down by another person, then copied by hand across generations. In a world where information traveled slowly, certainty was fragile. Medieval maps themselves reflected this limited understanding. They were often symbolic, blending geography with belief and legend. So Marco's descriptions did something subtle but important. He spoke not of mythical lands, but of functioning societies. Not monsters or fables, but trade, cities, and daily life. A shift from legend toward observation. Over time, his book expanded what Europeans believed possible. It did not instantly transform understanding, but it widened imagination. By the 15th century, as exploration began expanding outward, Marco's accounts were still circulating. Christopher Columbus is known to have carried a copy, studying its descriptions of Asia. Marco did not cause the age of exploration, but he helped make distant worlds feel real. How maps began to change. Marco Polo did not draw maps himself, but his descriptions contributed to a gradual shift in cartography. As knowledge expanded, maps slowly moved away from symbolic layouts toward more spatial ones. Coastlines sharpened, routes gained detail. The world became something to measure and chart, not just imagine. Marco's stories were part of that quiet transformation. In many ways, Marco Polo stands at a threshold in history. A man shaped by the medieval world, whose experiences echoed into the early modern one. His life did not instantly change Europe, but it widened the sense of what the world could be. By the time Marco's life drew toward its later years, the roads he had traveled were behind him. But the movement continued. His story passed from memory to manuscript to copies carried across generations. A different kind of journey, one that moved not by caravan or ship, but by story. Final years and legacy, the quiet ending of a vast life. After prison, Marco returned to ordinary rhythms. Marriage, business, family, Venice settling gently around him again. The world he had crossed living mostly in memory. In later years, he became something unusual. A man who had seen too much to fully belong anywhere. In Venice, he was known as the traveler, the one who had walked beyond the edges of maps. Some listened with awe, others with doubt. But Marco no longer needed to prove anything. He had already lived it. The final days, in 1324, after a life that stretched across continents, Marco Polo lay dying. Family gathered near, the quiet sounds of Venice beyond the windows, and according to those present, someone urged him to take back the stories, to admit they had been exaggerated, to soften them. Marco refused, and with what strength remained, he spoke the words that would echo through history. I have not told half of what I saw, and now, as the story comes to rest, you can let it soften. A boy beside quiet canals, a traveler beneath endless stars, a voice in a quiet prison cell. All of it, one long road, and like all roads, it does not truly end. It continues in stories told softly across time, in maps widened by wonder, in journeys yet to begin. And tonight, you have walked a little of it too. You don't need to hold the story now. You can let it drift gently away, like lantern light fading across still water, like footsteps softening in the sand. The road grows quiet, the night grows wide, and somewhere, beneath a sky full of distant stars, the journey continues, endlessly, gently, at rest. Good night.